Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to the grand palaces of Victorian Britain, where marble staircases gleamed under gaslight and every room held a secret. Beneath the chandeliers and above the servant bells, a hidden world existed. Men who dressed the queen, men who served the prince, men who loved each other in rooms the history books would never visit. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it was like to serve a queen who could never know the truth about you? Have you ever wondered who polished the silver in Buckingham Palace at 4 a.m, heart racing after a stolen kiss in the pantry? Have you ever wondered how 2 footmen fell in love when their entire lives were visible, documented, controlled? What did they whisper to each other in the narrow attic rooms where servants slept? How did they survive in a world that would destroy them for a glance that lasted too long? Who protected them when the world would not? And what did they risk? What did they lose for love that had no name, no legal standing, no future? What would you have done if you had been one of them? The first thing you need to understand about being a gay servant in a Victorian royal household is this: you were never alone. And that was the problem. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the family upstairs. You, on the other hand, lived in a world of shared bedrooms, open doors, and hierarchies so rigid they made the Church of England look relaxed. The housekeeper knew when you woke. The butler knew when you ate. The other footman knew when you breathed. Your life was a performance, and the stage was always lit. Let us start with the basics. The year is 1885. You are 23 years old, and you have just been hired as a footman at Marlborough House, the London residence of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the man who would become King Edward VII. You were hired because you are tall, handsome, and have good calves. Yes, calves. Footmen were chosen for their looks. The royal family wanted their servants to be decorative. You are, essentially, human furniture. Your uniform is immaculate. Dark blue livery with gold braid, white gloves, powdered hair on formal occasions, though that tradition is fading by the 1880s, thank God. You stand in hallways for hours, you open doors, you serve meals, you carry trays, you exist to be invisible until needed, and then to be perfectly, silently efficient. You share a room with 3 other footmen on the top floor of Marlborough House. The room is cold, the ceiling slants. There is one window and it faces a brick wall. You each have a narrow iron bed, a small wooden chest for your belongings, and approximately 18 inches of personal space. You can hear the man in the next bed breathing at night. You can hear him dreaming. One of those men is named Thomas. Thomas arrived 6 months before you. He is 25, dark-haired, with a slight scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall. He has kind eyes. He is the sort of person who remembers your name the first time you meet, who asks if you are settling in, who shows you where the prince keeps his cigars, and which hallways to avoid when the princess is in a mood. You like him immediately. You tell yourself, that is all it is. Liking. It is not all it is. Within 2 weeks, you are watching for him in every room. You time your tasks to coincide with his. You volunteer to help carry the heavy trays he is assigned because it gives you an excuse to stand near him, to brush past him in the narrow servants' corridors, to hear him laugh at some small joke you make about the under-butler's moustache. You are careful. You are so careful. But your heart is not careful, and it does not care about Victorian employment law. The thing about royal households is that they run on gossip. Servants talk, they notice, they watch, and they judge. George Chauncey, in his work on gay subcultures, documented how men in close quarters developed unspoken codes, ways of signalling interest, ways of recognizing each other. Victorian servants had their own version. A glance held a second too long, a hand lingering when passing a dish, certain jokes, certain silences. You learned to read the room the way a sailor reads the sea, watching for storms, for safe harbours, for others like you navigating the same dangerous waters. Thomas, you realise by the end of your first month, is reading you back. It happens in small moments. He stands closer to you than necessary when you are polishing silver in the pantry. He asks if you are cold one night and offers you his extra blanket, even though he must know you have your own. He defends you when the senior footman criticises your work, something he does not do for others. And once, late at night when you both cannot sleep, he tells you about a friend he had in his last position, another footman, he says, who left suddenly under circumstances he does not name. His voice when he tells you this is careful, soft, like he is handing you something fragile and waiting to see if you will hold it gently. You do. By winter, you are in love. You have never said the words. You do not have the words. The language does not exist yet, not in a way you can access. The term homosexual was coined by a German-Austrian writer named Karl Maria Kurtbeny in 1868, but it lives in medical journals and legal debates, not in the attic rooms of Marlborough House. You have heard the word sodomite, always spat like a curse. You have heard unnatural, deviant, molly. None of those words feel like they belong to what you feel when Thomas smiles at you, so you do not name it. You just live it. In January of 1886, you and Thomas are assigned to serve at a dinner for 40 guests. The Prince of Wales is hosting members of Parliament, minor royalty, and several actresses whose presence would scandalise the Queen if she knew. You and Thomas spend 4 hours on your feet, pouring wine, clearing plates, standing at attention along the wall. Your feet ache, your back aches. The room is stifling with body heat and cigar smoke. At one point, Thomas stumbles slightly, just a half step, and you reach out to steady him. Your hand catches his elbow. It lasts less than 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, his eyes meet yours, and you see it. He feels the same way you do. After the guests leave, and the table is cleared, you and Thomas are sent to the kitchen to help wash the crystal. It is nearly 2 a.m. The house is finally quiet. You are alone, or as alone as 2 servants ever are, in a stone-walled room lit by a single oil lamp. Your hands are in cold, soapy water. Thomas is drying the glasses, careful not to leave streaks. He says your name. Just your name. You look up, and he tells you quietly that he has something he wants to show you. You follow him through the darkened servants' corridors, past the sleeping rooms, down a back staircase you have never used. He leads you to a small storage room on the ground floor, a place where they keep spare linens and cleaning supplies. It smells like lavender and soap. There is one tiny window near the ceiling, and moonlight slants through it in a thin blue line. Thomas closes the door. He does not lock it. There is no lock. He stands there in the near dark, and he is shaking slightly. He tells you he has been thinking. He tells you he knows it is dangerous. He tells you he will understand if you want to leave. But he says he cannot keep pretending. He cannot keep acting like you are just another footman, just another colleague, just another body in the room. And then he kisses you. It is brief, soft, terrified. His lips barely brush yours before he pulls back, searching your face for any sign of rejection, any sign of horror, any sign that he has just ruined both your lives. You kiss him back. For 3 minutes, in a storage room that smells like lavender, you hold him. You kiss him like the world is ending, because in a way it is. If anyone finds out, you will both be dismissed at best, arrested at worst. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, passed just months earlier, made all sexual acts between men illegal, even in private. The law was nicknamed the Blackmailer's Charter because it gave power to anyone who discovered your secret. You could be prosecuted, you could be imprisoned, you could be destroyed. And yet, you kiss him anyway. You will remember that night for the rest of your life. Not because it was the beginning of a grand romance, though it was, but because it was the first time you felt, in your body, that you were not alone, that there was someone else in the world who saw you and did not look away. When you finally return to your shared room, the other footmen are asleep. You lie in your narrow bed, 3 feet from Thomas in his, and you do not sleep at all. You just listen to him breathe. And you think, this is worth it. Whatever happens, this is worth it. Let us talk about the architecture of secrecy. Victorian royal households were designed for visibility. Every room had a purpose. Every hallway had a function. Servants moved through the house like blood through veins, essential, constant, and largely ignored by those upstairs. But that visibility was also surveillance. You were always seen, always watched, always one mistake away from dismissal. The layout of a grand house like Marlborough House or Buckingham Palace was a hierarchy made physical. The royal family lived on the principal floors, high ceilings, tall windows, silk wallpaper, art worth more than you would earn in 10 lifetimes. The guest rooms were 1 floor down. The servants' quarters were at the very top, tucked under the roof, or in the basement, tucked below ground. You entered through separate doors. You used separate staircases. You lived in a parallel world that touched the world upstairs only when summoned. The servants' staircase was narrow, steep, unlit except for what daylight filtered down from above or what candle you carried with you. You climbed it 12 times a day. Your legs burned, your lungs ached. You learned to move quickly, quietly, invisibly. But those staircases were also the only truly private spaces in the house. No one upstairs ever used them. No one watched them. If you were careful, very, very careful, you could steal 30 seconds on a landing with someone. You could brush hands. You could whisper something that sounded like a normal exchange to any passerby but meant everything to the person hearing it. You and Thomas became experts at stolen moments, a touch when passing on the stairs, a glance across the servants' hall during meals. Once, memorably, he pressed a folded note into your hand while you were both serving tea in the drawing room, and you had to wait 4 agonizing hours before you could read it in private. It said, "Tonight, if you can. Midnight. The linen room." You went. You always went. The servants' hall was the other critical space in your world. This was where you ate, where you gathered during the brief windows of free time, where the hierarchy of service was performed daily. The butler sat at the head of the table. The housekeeper sat at the other end. Everyone else arranged themselves by rank: senior footman, junior footman, housemaids in descending order of seniority, kitchen maids at the far end. You were near the bottom. Meals were eaten in silence unless the butler gave permission to speak. You learned to communicate with your eyes, with the tilt of your head, with the smallest shifts in posture. You learned to hide in plain sight. Thomas was good at this, better than you. He had been doing it longer. He told you once, late at night in the linen room, that he had known since he was 15. He had worked in 3 households before Marlborough House. In the first, he had been 17 and foolish, and he had fallen for a groom who worked in the stables. They were caught. Not in the act, nothing so dramatic, but someone had seen them talking too often, standing too close, and the housekeeper had decided it was safer to dismiss them both than to let rumours grow. No reference letters, no explanation, just gone. Thomas had learned. He had learned to be invisible. He had learned to smile at the housemaids so no one would suspect. He had learned to flirt just enough with the girls in the kitchen that the other men would think he was normal, harmless, one of them. He had learned to make himself small, and then you arrived, and he decided he was tired of being small. You were not his first love, but you were, he told you, the first person he had loved without shame. The first person who made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a version of the future where he did not have to pretend forever. You wanted to give him that future. You had no idea how. Let us name some others. You were not the only gay men in service, not even close. The royal households of Victorian Britain were, in many ways, a refuge for men like you. Not because they were safe, but because they offered proximity to others like you. Servants moved between households, carrying news, carrying gossip, carrying the knowledge of who could be trusted and who could not. There was a network, informal, invisible, but real. At Buckingham Palace, there was a man named Frederick. He was a page to Queen Victoria herself, and he had been in service since the 1860s. He was discreet, careful, and utterly indispensable. The Queen trusted him, and because she trusted him, he had a certain latitude that others did not. He knew other men. He passed along warnings when someone was being watched too closely. He helped people disappear when they needed to. Frederick never spoke openly about his own life, but everyone knew. You did not survive 30 years in royal service as a bachelor with no interest in marriage unless you had something to hide and were very, very good at hiding it. At Sandringham, the Prince of Wales's country estate, there was a footman named James who had a relationship with one of the undergardeners for 2 years. They were careful. They met in the gardens after dark, in the hedge maze where no one could see. They were never caught. James eventually left service to open a small shop in Norwich. No one knows what happened to the gardener. And then there was the case of the Honourable William Coutts Keppel. Keppel was not a servant. He was the younger son of an earl. But his story intersects with the servant world in important ways. Keppel served in the military, as many younger sons did, but he was known in certain circles for his relationships with men. In the 1880s, he became involved with a private secretary to a member of the royal household. The details were never made fully public, but there were rumours, whispers, the kind of whispers that could end careers. Keppel survived because of his class. He had money, title, and family connections. The private secretary was dismissed. The servant world saw this and understood. Your class determined whether you could survive exposure. You and Thomas had no title, no money, no protection, so you were more careful than careful. By the spring of 1886, you and Thomas had developed a routine. You met in the linen room twice a week, always late at night, always for no more than 20 minutes. It was not much, but it was yours. You talked. That was the surprising part. You had expected that stolen time would be frantic, physical, desperate, and sometimes it was. But more often you just talked. Thomas told you about growing up in Sussex, the son of a blacksmith. He told you about his younger sister, who had died of scarlet fever when she was 8. He told you he had wanted to be a teacher once, but his family could not afford the training. He told you he liked poetry, though he had to borrow books in secret, because the butler would think it was above his station. You told him about your own family, your mother, who took in sewing to make ends meet, your father, who drank, your older brother, who had gone to work in a factory in Manchester and who you had not seen in 4 years. You told him you had left home at 16 because staying was not safe, though you did not say why. He did not ask. He understood that some stories lived too close to the bone. One night in April, Thomas brought a book. It was a slim volume of poetry by Alfred Tennyson. He had borrowed it from the library at Marlborough House, where servants were occasionally allowed to take books no one upstairs was reading. He opened it to a poem called In Memoriam, written for Tennyson's friend Arthur Hallam, who had died young. Thomas read aloud, quietly, in the near dark. My love has talked with rocks and trees, he finds on misty mountain ground, his own vast shadow glory crowned. He looked up at you when he finished. He said, Do you think Tennyson loved him? You said, Yes. Thomas closed the book. He said, "Good. That night, he told you he loved you. Not in those exact words. He said something like, 'I think about you all the time. I cannot imagine doing this without you. You are the best thing that has happened to me.' But you heard what he meant. You told him you loved him too. You kissed him. You held him. You promised each other nothing, because promises felt dangerous. But you both understood that this was no longer just a brief affair. This was something you would fight to keep. 3 weeks later, everything fell apart. It started with a letter, not a letter you wrote, not a letter Thomas wrote. A letter from someone else entirely, delivered to Marlborough House and addressed to the Prince of Wales's private secretary. The letter accused 2 footmen, unnamed, of immoral conduct unbecoming to the dignity of the royal household. It provided no specifics, no evidence, just an accusation, venomous and anonymous. The private secretary did what private secretaries do. He passed it to the butler. The butler called a meeting of all male servants the next morning. He stood at the head of the servants' hall, stern and unsmiling, and he read the letter aloud. He did not name anyone. He said that if any servant had knowledge of immoral behaviour, it was their duty to report it. He said the royal household had a reputation to uphold. He said that anyone found guilty of such behaviour would be dismissed immediately and without reference. Then he looked around the room, slowly, meeting every man's eyes. You kept your face blank. You had learned, in your months of service, how to disappear behind your own expression. You looked mildly concerned, appropriately attentive, and entirely innocent. Thomas did the same. But someone in that room was watching you both, and someone in that room had decided you were guilty. You never found out who wrote the letter. You have theories. There was a senior footman named Edward who had resented Thomas since the day he arrived, for reasons you never fully understood. There was a hall boy who had been dismissed 2 months earlier and who might have wanted revenge on anyone still employed. There was the under-butler, who was deeply religious and who had once given a lecture on the evils of sin that felt uncomfortably specific. It could have been any of them. It could have been someone you never suspected. The point is, the letter existed, and once it existed, the machinery of suspicion began to turn. The butler started watching. The housekeeper started asking questions. Servants were pulled aside one by one and asked if they had seen anything unusual. Most said no. A few said they had noticed that you and Thomas seemed friendly, but that was all. Friendly. Nothing more. It should have been enough to deflect suspicion. Servants were friendly all the time. Friendships were normal, expected even, in the close quarters of a royal household. But the butler was not satisfied. He began checking the household logs, records of which servants were assigned to which tasks, at which times. He noticed that you and Thomas had often been assigned to the same duties. He noticed that you both had requested the same half-day off in March. He noticed that on 3 separate occasions, you had both been absent from your beds during the night, returning only in the early morning hours. That last detail came from one of the other footmen in your shared room, a man named George, who had said nothing during the initial inquiry, but who had apparently been keeping a private list of your comings and goings. You do not know if George suspected the truth, or if he simply disliked you, or if he was trying to curry favour with the butler. It does not matter. He gave the butler what the butler needed, a pattern. On a Tuesday morning in May, you and Thomas were summoned separately to the butler's pantry. You went first. The butler sat behind his desk, his face impassive. He asked you a series of questions. Where were you on the night of April 12th? Why had you been absent from your room? Who had you been with? You lied. You said you had gone for a walk because you could not sleep. You said you had been alone. You said you often took walks when the house was quiet, to clear your head. The butler asked if you had ever been in the linen room after hours. You said no. He asked if you had a particular friendship with Thomas. You said you were friendly with all the footmen, but nothing more. He watched you for a long time. Then he dismissed you. Thomas was called in next. You waited in the corridor outside, your heart pounding so hard you thought it would break through your ribs. You tried to hear what was being said, but the door was too thick. When Thomas emerged, his face was white. He did not look at you. He walked past you as if you were a stranger. You knew then that it was over. That night, you were both informed that you were being dismissed. No explanation was given beyond conduct unbecoming. No evidence was presented, no trial, no chance to defend yourselves. Just a brief, cold conversation with the butler, and then you were told to pack your belongings and leave by morning. You were given no reference letters. That was the worst part. Without a reference from your previous employer, you could not get another position in service. Your career was over. Thomas packed in silence. You wanted to speak to him, to touch him, to tell him you were sorry, but the room was full of other footmen, and you could not risk it. So you said nothing. You folded your spare shirt. You wrapped your few possessions in a cloth bundle. You lay down in your narrow bed for the last time and stared at the ceiling until dawn. In the morning, you and Thomas left Marlborough House through the servants' entrance. Separately. You first, then him 10 minutes later. You never saw him again. You stood on the street outside Marlborough House with a cloth bundle in one hand and £3 in your pocket, your final wages, paid without comment. It was 6 in the morning. The street sweepers were already at work. The city smelled like coal smoke and horse dung and the particular sourness of London at dawn. You had nowhere to go. Your family home in Kent was not an option. You had not written to your mother in 2 years, and even if you had, you could not return there with no position and no prospects. Your father would want to know what happened. You would have to lie or tell a truth that would destroy you both. So you walked. You walked south through Mayfair, past the grand houses where other servants were already awake, already working, already living the life you had lost. You walked past St. James's Park, where nursemaids pushed prams and gentlemen took their morning exercise. You walked until your feet ached and your bundle grew heavy and you realized you had no plan, no destination, no future. You found yourself in Charing Cross. The streets here were busier, louder, filled with people who had also woken too early or never gone to sleep. You bought a cup of weak tea from a street vendor and sat on a bench near the station, watching the city wake up around you. You thought about Thomas. You wondered where he had gone. You wondered if he was sitting on a bench somewhere too, holding cold tea, trying to figure out what came next. You wondered if he was thinking about you. You would never know. The thing about losing everything is that it happens faster than you expect. One day you have a job, a bed, a routine, a person who loves you. The next day you have £3 and a street bench. The Victorian world did not believe in second chances for men like you. You were disposable. There were 1,000 other young men in London who would take your position, who would sleep in your bed, who would polish the same silver and serve the same family and never ask questions. You had been replaced before you even left the building. Let us pull back for a moment and talk about what happened to men who were dismissed this way. The records are incomplete. Servants who left under a cloud rarely appeared in official documents again unless they were arrested. And even then, their stories were often reduced to a single line in a court ledger. But we can piece together the pattern from what survives. Some men went home. If they had family who would take them in, if they could invent a plausible story about why they left service, they might survive by returning to whatever trade or village they had come from. They would marry eventually, because marriage was expected. They would live quiet, small lives. They would never speak about what had happened. Some men disappeared into the urban poor. London in the 1880s had a massive underclass of casual labourers, men who worked day-to-day jobs loading cargo at the docks, sweeping streets, hauling coal. The work was brutal and the pay was terrible, but it required no references and no questions. You could vanish into that world if you were willing to give up any hope of stability. Some men turned to crime. Not violent crime usually, but theft, fraud, blackmail. If you had been in service, you knew how wealthy households operated. You knew their schedules, their vulnerabilities, their secrets. Some dismissed servants used that knowledge. The newspapers of the era are full of cases where a former footman or valet was arrested for stealing from his previous employer or for blackmailing a gentleman whose secrets he had learned, and some men found each other. By the 1880s, London had a small but visible underground world of queer meeting places. They were not safe, they were not legal, but they existed. Certain pubs in the East End, certain parks after dark, certain streets in Soho where men walked slowly, looking for others like them. The historian Hugh Trevor Roper, in his work on Victorian London's hidden communities, found records of at least 24 pubs that were known gathering spots for gay men in the 1880s and 90s. The police raided them periodically, but they always reopened, always under new management, always with the same clientele. You did not know about these places yet, not on that first morning. You were 23 years old, and you had spent your entire adult life in the controlled environment of service. You had no map for the world you had just entered, but you would learn. You spent your first night of freedom, if you can call it that, in a doss house in Whitechapel. A doss house was the cheapest accommodation available. A room full of rope stretched across at chest height, where men paid a penny to drape themselves over the rope and sleep standing up. You paid 2p for an actual bed, which meant a wooden shelf with a thin mattress and a blanket that smelled like 12 other people had used it. Which they had. The room held 30 men. It was loud. Someone was coughing in the corner, a wet, rattling cough that did not stop. Someone else was snoring. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and tobacco, and something you could not identify but which made your eyes water. You lay on your shelf and stared at the ceiling and thought, this is my life now. You had £3. At a penny or 2p a night for lodging and a few pennies a day for food, you could survive for perhaps 6 weeks if you were careful. 6 weeks to find work. 6 weeks to build some kind of future from nothing. You fell asleep trying to calculate how long you could stretch your money if you only ate once a day. In the morning, you went looking for work. You tried the docks first. The West India docks and the London docks hired casual labourers every morning. Men who would load and unload cargo ships for £1 a day. You stood in the crowd at the dock gates at 6 in the morning, along with 200 other men, and waited for the foreman to walk through and pick who he wanted. He picked men who looked strong, men who looked desperate, men who looked like they would not complain. He did not pick you. You tried again the next day, and the next. On the 4th day, the foreman pointed at you and 20 others, and you spent 10 hours hauling sacks of grain from a ship's hold to a warehouse. The sacks weighed £80 each. Your back screamed. Your hands blistered and bled. At the end of the day, you were paid £1. £1, 12p, enough for lodging and 1 meal. You did this for 2 weeks. Some days you were picked. Some days you were not. On the days you were not picked, you did not eat. You lost weight. You stopped shaving because you could not afford a barber, and you did not trust yourself with a razor in the dirty water of the doss house. You started to look like the other men around you. Gaunt, tired, anonymous. You were becoming invisible in a different way than you had been invisible in service. In service, you were invisible because you were efficient, because you blended into the background of wealth. Now you were invisible because the world did not care if you lived or died. You thought about Thomas every night. You wondered if he had found work. You wondered if he was still in London. You wondered if he thought about you. You had no way to reach him. You did not know where he was. Servants did not have addresses. They lived where they worked, and when they stopped working, they simply disappeared. You told yourself you would forget him eventually. You told yourself it had been a brief thing, a few stolen moments, nothing that could last. You told yourself you needed to focus on survival. You did not forget him. In your 3rd week of freedom, you met a man named Peter. Peter worked at the docks too. He was older than you, perhaps 35, with a thick beard and hands like slabs of meat. He had been a sailor once, he told you, but he had been injured in a fall and could no longer climb rigging. So now he hauled cargo when he could and did odd jobs when he could not. Peter noticed you because you were struggling. You were not built for dock work. You were built to carry tea trays and open doors. Your body was giving out. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal shift unloading coal, Peter found you sitting against a warehouse wall, trying not to vomit from exhaustion. He sat down next to you. He handed you a flask of water. He asked if you were all right. You said you were fine. He said you were a terrible liar. You laughed because it was true. Peter asked where you were from. You told him you had been in service. He nodded slowly, and you saw recognition in his eyes. Not judgment, just recognition. He said, "Got yourself dismissed, did you?" You said, "Something like that." He said, "Happens to the best of us." You looked at him. You did not say anything, but he saw the question in your face. He said very quietly, "I was a steward on a merchant ship, 8 years. They caught me with another sailor. We were both put off at the next port. No pay, no papers. That was 12 years ago. You felt something loosen in your chest. Not relief exactly, but the weight of isolation, just slightly lighter. Peter became your friend, not in the way Thomas had been. There was no romance, no tension, no midnight meetings. Peter was simply another man who had survived what you were surviving, and he was willing to show you how. He taught you which foremen at the docks were fair and which would cheat you on wages. He taught you which doss houses were safer and which were full of thieves. He taught you how to stretch a loaf of bread across 3 days. He taught you where to find day-old vegetables that the market sellers would sell cheap at closing time. And one night, over weak beer in a pub that smelled like sawdust and old smoke, he told you about the 100 Guineas. The 100 Guineas was a pub near Leicester Square. Peter said it carefully, watching your face to see if you understood. He said it was a place where men like you, like us, he corrected himself, could go. He said you had to be careful. The police knew about it. They raided it sometimes. But it was also a place where you could be yourself, at least for an hour or two. He said, "If you want, I can take you." You said yes. The 100 Guineas looked, from the outside, like any other London pub. A narrow building squeezed between a butcher shop and a print works with a faded sign and grimy windows. You would walk past it 100 times and never notice it. But inside, it was different. Peter led you through the front room, which was full of normal pub goers, workmen drinking after a long shift, a few women in the corner laughing too loud. But at the back, there was a second room, smaller, darker. And when you stepped through the doorway, you felt it immediately. The shift in energy, in possibility. There were perhaps 20 men in the room. Some were talking in pairs. Some were sitting alone, watching. Some were dancing, actually dancing, which you had never seen men do together in public. A piano player in the corner was playing a music hall tune, and 2 men were waltzing in the small space between the tables, and no one was stopping them. You stood in the doorway, frozen. Peter touched your elbow. He said, "Breathe." You breathed. He led you to a table in the corner and bought you a pint. You sat down. You looked around the room, trying not to stare but unable to stop. Some of the men were dressed ordinarily, working-class clothes, flat caps, rough jackets, but others were more flamboyant. A man near the bar wore a bright silk scarf and had painted his eyelids with something that glittered in the lamplight. Another man wore a flower in his buttonhole and spoke with exaggerated gestures, his voice carrying across the room. Peter saw you watching. He said, "The police call them mollies. Queer folk have been calling them that for 100 years. Some men like to be seen. Some men like to hide. No wrong way to do it." You nodded. You did not know what you were. You had spent your whole life hiding, but sitting in this room, surrounded by men who were not hiding, or who were hiding in a different way, you felt something you had not felt since you left Marlborough House. You felt possible. You went back to the 100 Guineas 3 times over the next 2 weeks. You never spoke to anyone except Peter. You just sat in the corner and watched. You watched men flirt. You watched men argue. You watched men leave together, slipping out the back door into the alley. You watched the piano player accept coins and play requests. You watched a man in a velvet jacket read poetry aloud to a small group gathered around him, and the poem was about love, and everyone knew what kind of love, and no one pretended otherwise. On your fourth visit, a man approached your table. He was young, perhaps your age, with light brown hair and nervous eyes. He asked if he could sit down. You said yes. His name was William. He had been a clerk in a law office until 6 months ago, when his employer had discovered letters he had written to another man. He had been dismissed. Now he worked as a copyist, taking whatever jobs he could find, barely surviving. You told him you had been a footman. You did not tell him where. You did not tell him about Thomas. But you told him enough. William said, "Do you miss it? Service?" You said, "Every day." He said, "Me too. I miss having a future." You bought him a drink. You talked for an hour. It was not romantic. It was not even particularly deep. But it was human connection, and that was enough. When you left the pub that night, Peter walked with you back toward Whitechapel. He said, "You are going to be all right." You wanted to believe him. Let us talk about the Cleveland Street scandal, because it is impossible to discuss gay servants in Victorian royal households without addressing the moment when the whole hidden world nearly exploded into public view. In July of 1889, a few years after your dismissal from Marlborough House, the London police raided a house at 19 Cleveland Street, near Fitzrovia. The house was a brothel. That was not unusual. London had thousands of brothels. But this one was different. This one served male clients exclusively, and it employed young men, many of them telegraph boys from the General Post Office, as sex workers. The raid led to arrests. The arrests led to interrogations. And the interrogations led to names. Some of those names were servants. Some were aristocrats. And some were rumoured to be connected to the royal family itself. Lord Arthur Somerset, an equerry to the Prince of Wales, was named. He fled to France before he could be arrested. Henry Fitzroy, Earl of Euston, was also named. He denied everything and sued a newspaper for libel, and the case went to trial, where details of the Cleveland Street house were aired in open court. The newspapers had a field day. The public was scandalised. And then quietly, the case was shut down. Several young men were prosecuted and imprisoned. But the aristocrats, the men with titles and connections, they were allowed to leave the country. The police stopped investigating. The government stopped asking questions. The message was clear. The law applied to poor men, to working class men, to servants and telegraph boys. The law did not apply to those who could afford to be above it. H. Montgomery Hyde, the historian who wrote the definitive account of the Cleveland Street scandal, found letters showing that the government was desperate to avoid implicating anyone close to the Prince of Wales. The royal household could not afford another scandal, so the case was buried. But the servants and working class men involved, their names were printed in the newspapers. Their lives were destroyed. Some were imprisoned. Some fled. Some killed themselves. The Cleveland Street scandal confirmed what you already knew from your own dismissal. In Victorian Britain, your class determined whether you could survive being gay. If you were wealthy, you could escape to France and live comfortably in exile. If you were a servant, you were thrown to the wolves. You read about the scandal in the newspapers. By 1889, you had found steadier work, a position in a warehouse, not glamorous but reliable, and you could afford to buy a paper once a week. You read the accounts of the trial. You read the descriptions of the Cleveland Street house. You read the interviews with the telegraph boys who were portrayed as innocent victims corrupted by degenerate aristocrats. And you thought about Thomas. You thought about the butler at Marlborough House, and the letter, and the quiet machinery of suspicion that had destroyed both of you. You thought about how easily it could have been worse. You could have been arrested. You could have been prosecuted. You could have been named in a newspaper. Instead, you were just erased. You did not know if that was better. By 1890, you had been out of service for 4 years. You were 27 years old. You worked in a warehouse near the Thames, sorting imported goods and keeping inventory. The work was boring but steady. You had your own room now, in a boarding house in Suffolk. It was small and cold, and the landlady was suspicious of everyone. But it was yours. You still went to the 100 Guineas occasionally, though less often than before. Peter had moved to Birmingham to work in a factory. William, the former clerk, had disappeared. You did not know if he had left London or if something worse had happened. Men disappeared all the time. You were lonely, not desperately, not the way you had been in those first weeks after leaving Marlborough House. But the loneliness was constant, a low hum in the background of your life. You worked, you ate, you slept, you survived. You thought about Thomas less often now. When you did think about him, it was with a kind of distant sadness, like remembering a book you had loved but could no longer find. You wondered if he was still alive. You wondered if he had found someone else. You wondered if he ever thought about you. You told yourself it did not matter. You told yourself you had moved on. And then, on a cold November evening in 1890, you saw him. You were walking home from work, cutting through a side street near Covent Garden to avoid the crowds on the main road. The street was narrow, lined with shops that were closing for the day, and there, standing outside a tobacconist, was Thomas. He looked older, thinner. His coat was worn at the elbows. But it was him. You stopped walking. Your heart was pounding so hard you thought you might collapse. He had not seen you yet. He was talking to someone, a woman, middle-aged, carrying a basket of flowers. They seemed to be negotiating a price. He was smiling, that same small, careful smile you remembered. You could have walked away. You could have turned around and gone a different direction and let the past stay in the past. You did not walk away. You stepped forward. You said his name. He turned. He saw you. And for a moment, his face went completely blank, as if he could not process what he was seeing. Then he said your name, very quietly, like he was afraid saying it too loud would make you disappear. You stood there on the street, 3 feet apart, staring at each other. The flower seller finished packing her basket and walked away, leaving you alone. Thomas said, "I thought I would never see you again." You said, "I thought the same thing." He looked like he wanted to say more, but he did not. He just stood there, holding a small paper-wrapped package of tobacco, looking at you like you were a ghost. You said, "Are you all right?" He nodded. Then he shook his head. Then he said, "Can we talk?" You said yes. You found a pub 2 streets away. Not the 100 Guineas, neither of you suggested it. Just an ordinary pub, full of ordinary people. You sat in a corner booth where no one would notice you. You ordered 2 pints. And then finally, you talked. Thomas told you what had happened after he left Marlborough House. He had tried to find work in service, but without a reference it was impossible. He had tried manual labour, but he was not strong enough. He had ended up working in a print shop, setting type for a penny dreadful publisher. The pay was terrible and the hours were long, but it was steady. He had a room in Clerkenwell. He lived alone. He had not been back to Sussex. His family thought he was still in service. He asked what had happened to you. You told him about the docks, about the warehouse, about Peter and the 100 Guineas. You did not tell him how much you had missed him. You did not tell him that you had thought about him every single day for 4 years. But he knew. You could see it in his eyes. Thomas said, "I wrote you a letter." You looked up, surprised. He said, "After I left Marlborough House, I wrote you a letter. I had no way to send it, so I kept it. I have carried it with me for 4 years. I kept thinking maybe one day I would find you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges from being carried. He said, "Do you want to read it?" You said yes. He handed it to you. You unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was his, neat and precise from years of filling out household ledgers. The letter was short. It said, "I do not know where you are. I do not know if you are safe. I do not know if I will ever see you again. But I need you to know that I loved you. I still love you. What we had was real. They can take our jobs and our futures, but they cannot take that. I hope you find happiness. I hope you find someone who sees you the way I saw you. I hope you survive this. I am trying to survive it too." You read it twice. Then you folded it and handed it back to him. You said, "I loved you too." Thomas closed his eyes. He said, "Past tense. You said, "No. Present." He opened his eyes. He looked at you for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took your hand. Right there, in a public pub, in 1890. He took your hand. You should have pulled away. Anyone could see. Anyone could report you. But you did not pull away. You held his hand. And for the first time in 4 years, you felt like you were home. You and Thomas left the pub together that night. You walked through the streets of London without a destination, just walking, because neither of you wanted to say goodbye yet. The city was settling into its evening rhythm, gas lamps being lit, shop shutters closing, the traffic thinning. November fog hung low between the buildings, muffling sound, turning every street lamp into a soft halo of yellow light. Thomas told you about the print shop where he worked. It was owned by a man named Archer, who published cheaply printed novels, adventure stories, crime tales, romances with lurid covers. Thomas set the type, standing at a compositor's bench for 10 hours a day, picking tiny metal letters from cases and arranging them into words, sentences, pages. His fingers were stained with ink permanently now. He showed you his hands. The black had settled into the creases of his knuckles, the whorls of his fingerprints. It would not wash out. He said the work was monotonous, but it had a kind of peace to it. No one watched him constantly. No one cared if he smiled or frowned or thought his own thoughts. He just set type, and the hours passed. And at the end of the day, he was paid 4p per 1,000 EMs of typesetting. It was not much, but it was his. You told him about the warehouse, about the endless rows of crates, the smell of coffee and tobacco and spices from a dozen countries you would never see, about the ledger you kept, tracking what came in and what went out, about the supervisor who drank and sometimes did not show up, and how you had learned to do his job as well as your own, without asking for more pay, because asking would mean drawing attention, and attention was dangerous. Thomas asked if you were happy. You said, "I am alive." That is more than I expected 4 years ago. He nodded. He understood. Survival was its own kind of victory. You walked until you reached the Thames. You stood on the embankment, leaning against the stone wall, looking out at the dark water. A few boats moved slowly upstream, their lights reflecting in broken lines on the surface. Somewhere across the river, a dog was barking. The fog was thicker here, rising off the water in ghostly sheets. Thomas said, "I thought about finding you. For months after I left, I thought about it. I even went back to Marlborough House once, stood outside on the street, hoping I might see you coming or going. I knew it was stupid. I knew you were gone. But I went anyway." You said, "When?" He said, 3 months after we were dismissed. It was raining. I stood there for 2 hours. I got soaked. I looked like a madman. A constable asked if I needed help, and I told him I was fine. And I left. I never went back. You were quiet for a moment. Then you said, "I used to dream about you. Not every night, but often enough. I would dream we were still at Marlborough House, and everything was fine, and we were in the linen room, and then I would wake up in the doss house and remember it was gone." Thomas looked at you. He said, "What do we do now?" You did not have an answer. The problem was not desire. You both wanted the same thing, to be together, to rebuild what you had lost, to try again. But the world had not changed. You were still 2 men with no protection, no legal standing, and no future that society would recognize. If you moved in together, the landlord would ask questions. If you were seen together too often, neighbors would gossip. If anyone suspected, you could be arrested, prosecuted under the Criminal Law Amendment Act, imprisoned for 2 years with hard labor. Oscar Wilde was still 5 years away from his trials, but the law that would destroy him was already in place. The law that had driven you out of service. The law that made your love a crime. Thomas said, "I have my room. It is small, but it is mine. I live alone. The landlady does not ask questions as long as I pay the rent. You could visit. Not often, but sometimes. You said, I would like that. He smiled. It was the first real smile you had seen from him all night. He said, tomorrow? You said, tomorrow. You started seeing Thomas twice a week, Wednesdays and Sundays. Those were your half days off from the warehouse. You would finish work at midday, walk to Clerkenwell, and climb the 3 flights of stairs to his room. The room was exactly as he had described it. Small, 1 narrow bed, 1 chair, 1 table, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. He had a shelf of books, Tennyson, Dickens, a volume of Shakespeare, a few penny dreadfuls from the shop where he worked. He had tried to make the space his own, a drawing of the Sussex countryside, cut from a magazine, pinned to the wall, a small mirror, a tin cup that held pencils. You spent those afternoons talking. Making love, yes, but mostly talking. You had 4 years to catch up on. 4 years of stories, of survival, of small victories and large defeats. You told each other everything. Thomas told you about the time he had been robbed 2 years earlier. He had been walking home late from the print shop, and 2 men had cornered him in an alley and taken the week's wages he had just been paid. He had not fought back. He had just handed over the money and walked away. He said he had cried later, alone in his room, not because of the money, but because of the helplessness, the feeling that the world could take anything from him at any moment, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You told him about the night you had gotten drunk at the 100 Guineas and nearly been arrested. You had been sitting alone at a table, drinking cheap gin, feeling sorry for yourself. A man had approached you, older, well-dressed, clearly not working class. He had sat down without asking and started talking to you, asking questions, buying you drinks. You had been too drunk to realize what was happening. Peter, thank God, had been there. Peter had seen the man and recognized him. He was known for informing to the police. Peter had pulled you out of the pub, half carrying you, and taken you back to the Doss house to sleep it off. You had woken the next morning with a pounding headache and the knowledge that you had come within an inch of arrest. Thomas had his own near miss. A year earlier, a man at the print shop had started asking him pointed questions. Why was he not married? Why did he never talk about women? Did he have a sweetheart? Thomas had deflected, made jokes, invented a fictional girl back in Sussex. The man had seemed satisfied, but a week later, the same man had followed Thomas home from work. Just followed him, not saying anything, just walking 20 paces behind. Thomas had taken a circuitous route, turning down random streets, doubling back until he lost him. He never found out what the man wanted, but the message was clear. He was being watched. You both lived with this constant low-level fear, the fear of being seen, the fear of being known, the fear of the knock on the door that would mean police, arrest, trial, prison. But you also lived with hope, because you had found each other again, because the world had tried to separate you and failed, because twice a week, for a few hours, you could be yourselves. In the spring of 1891, Thomas lost his job at the print shop. The owner, Archer, had been losing money for months. The cheap novels were not selling as well as they used to. There were newer publishers with better distribution, flashier covers, more sensational stories. Archer could not compete. He laid off half his staff, Thomas among them. Thomas came to the warehouse to tell you. He found you in the sorting room, surrounded by crates of tea from Ceylon. He looked pale, shaken. He said, "I need to talk to you." You stepped outside with him into the alley behind the warehouse. He told you what had happened. He said he had 2 weeks' rent saved, maybe 3 if he was careful. After that, he did not know. You said, "Move in with me." Thomas stared at you. He said, "What?" You said, "My boarding house, my room. Move in with me. We will say you are my cousin. We will say you have come to London looking for work, and I am helping you get on your feet. The landlady will not care as long as we pay the rent." Thomas said, "That is insane. That is dangerous." You said, "Everything is dangerous. At least this way we are together." He looked at you for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you sure?" You said, "I have never been more sure of anything." 2 weeks later, Thomas moved into your room in Southwark. You told the landlady he was your cousin from Sussex, down on his luck, staying temporarily until he found a position. She looked at you skeptically, but said nothing. You paid an extra shilling a week for the second occupant. She took the money and did not ask questions. Thomas brought his few belongings in a canvas bag. His books, his clothes, the drawing from his wall, the letter he had carried for 4 years, which he now tucked into the drawer of the small table by the window. That first night, you lay in bed together, your bed, now shared, and listened to the sounds of the boarding house settling around you, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of someone coughing, the rattle of a cart passing in the street outside. Thomas said, "This will not last. You know that, right? Someone will notice. Someone will figure it out." You said, "Then we will have had this, however long it lasts." He rolled toward you, his face close to yours in the dark. He said, "I love you." You said, "I love you too." You kissed him, and for the first time in 6 years, since that night in the linen room at Marlborough House, you fell asleep holding him. You lived together for 2 years. 2 years. It does not sound like much. In the scope of a lifetime, it is barely anything. But for 2 gay men in Victorian London, it was a miracle. You developed a routine. You woke early and left for the warehouse while Thomas was still asleep. He would spend the day looking for work, sometimes finding a day of casual typesetting, sometimes helping at a printer's shop for a few pennies, sometimes finding nothing. You would come home in the evening to find him reading or cooking something simple on the small spirit stove you had bought. You would eat together, you would talk, you would go to bed. To anyone watching, you were 2 working-class men sharing a room to save money. Cousins, nothing unusual. London was full of men in similar arrangements. But you were careful. You never touched in public. You never used endearments where anyone could hear. When you walked together in the street, you kept a respectable distance. When you spoke to the landlady or the neighbours, you were polite, distant, unremarkable. Inside your room, behind a locked door, you were yourselves. Thomas found steady work eventually, at a different print shop in Southwark, closer to your boarding house. The pay was slightly better. You were both contributing to the rent now, to the food, to the small savings you were trying to build. You were surviving. You were more than surviving. You were building a life. You made friends with another tenant in the boarding house, a man named Albert who worked as a clerk for a shipping company. Albert was in his 40s, never married, and you suspected, though he never said it directly, that he was like you. He would invite you and Thomas to his room sometimes for tea or a game of cards. He never asked intrusive questions. He never made pointed remarks. But once, when Thomas was dealing cards and laughing at something you had said, you saw Albert watching you both with a small, sad smile. A smile that said, "I see you. I know. And I am glad you have each other." Albert became a kind of shield. If the landlady ever wondered why 2 young men were living together, she could see that they were friends with Albert, the respectable long-term tenant. If neighbours gossiped, Albert's presence made you seem ordinary. He was, without ever saying so, protecting you. You went to the 100 Guineas together a few times, you and Thomas. It felt different now. You were not going to meet someone, or to escape loneliness. You were going because it was a place where you could hold hands at a table, and no one would call the police. It was a place where you could dance, once, in a dark corner while the piano played, and feel like you were part of something larger than your own small survival. You met others there who were in similar situations. 2 men who worked as waiters and shared a flat in Soho. Another pair who claimed to be brothers, but whom everyone knew were not. A man who had been a servant in a royal household, not Marlborough House, but one of the smaller palaces, and who had been dismissed for the same unspoken reasons you had been. He told you his story over drinks, and you recognized every beat of it. The suspicion, the watching, the anonymous accusation, the cold dismissal. The erasure. His name was Edward. He was older than you, perhaps 35, and he had been out of service for nearly a decade. He had survived by becoming invisible. He worked in a warehouse, like you. He lived alone. He visited the 100 Guineas once a month, had a drink, talked to a few people, and left. He said he had given up on love years ago. It was too dangerous, too painful. Better to be alone and safe than together and vulnerable. You and Thomas left the pub that night, holding each other a little tighter. In the summer of 1892, the print shop where Thomas worked burned down. It was an accident. A lamp was knocked over in the back room where they stored the paper stock. The fire spread fast. The entire building went up in less than an hour. No one was killed, thank God, but the shop was destroyed. The owner had no insurance. He could not rebuild. Thomas was out of work again. This time, it was harder to find something new. The economy was contracting. Unemployment was rising. There were more men than jobs, and the jobs that existed paid less than they had a year earlier. Thomas looked for 6 weeks. He took anything he could find: a day unloading coal, a day sweeping a factory floor, a day handing out pamphlets on a street corner. But there was no steady work. Your savings dwindled. You started eating less, making a loaf of bread last 5 days instead of 3. You stopped buying tea. You darned your clothes until there was more darn than original fabric. You fell behind on the rent. The landlady knocked on your door one evening in August. She said you owed 3 weeks. She said if you did not pay by the end of the month, you would have to leave. She was not unkind about it. She was matter of fact. This was business. You promised her you would pay. You had no idea how. Thomas wanted to leave London. He said maybe there was work in the countryside, on farms, in small towns. Maybe life would be cheaper. Maybe they would be safer. You said, and live how? As what? 2 men alone together? It is harder to hide in a small town than in a city. He knew you were right, but he was desperate. You were both desperate. Albert helped. He lent you enough to cover the rent, saying you could pay him back whenever you were able. You knew he probably did not expect to be repaid. You took the money anyway, because pride is a luxury, and you could not afford it. Thomas found work in September at a printer's shop in Lambeth. The work was irregular and the pay was poor, but it was something. You started to breathe again, but the close call had shaken you both. You realized how fragile your life was. 1 fire, 1 month of bad luck, 1 landlady less patient, and everything could fall apart. Thomas said, "We should have a plan if something happens. If we get separated again." You said, "What kind of plan?" He thought for a moment. Then he said, "A place. A specific place. If we ever lose each other, we go there. Every Sunday at noon. We wait. We keep going every Sunday until the other person shows up." You said, "Where?" He said, "St. Paul's Cathedral. The steps outside. It is big enough that we can find it, but busy enough that no one will notice us waiting." You agreed. You made the promise. Every Sunday at noon, if you were ever separated, you would go to St. Paul's and wait. You hoped you would never need it. Let us talk about the servant network that existed in Victorian London, because it was more extensive than history often records. Servants moved between households constantly. A footman might work at one house for 2 years, then move to another for better wages or a higher position. A lady's maid might follow her mistress to a new household after a marriage. A butler might retire from a grand house and take a position at a smaller one. And as they moved, they carried information. They knew which households were good to work for and which were brutal. They knew which employers paid on time and which withheld wages for minor infractions. They knew which housekeepers were fair and which were tyrants. And they knew which households had gay servants and which servants were safe to trust. This information was never written down. It existed entirely in whispered conversations in pubs, in letters between friends, in the brief exchanges when servants from different households met in the park on their day off. But it was real. When you had been dismissed from Marlborough House in 1886, you had felt completely alone. But the truth was, Your story had spread. Other servants heard about the two footmen who were dismissed for unspecified moral failings. Some assumed the worst, some guessed the truth, and some, quietly, took note. Marlborough House is not safe. Be careful there. The Cleveland Street scandal in 1889 had amplified this network. After that case, servants across London became more cautious, but they also became more connected. They shared information about which households were actively watching for gay servants, which butlers were known to report suspicions to the police, which employers were indifferent as long as the work got done. There were households that were known as relatively safer. Not safe. Nowhere was truly safe, but safer. Households where the family was liberal or disinterested, or where the senior servants were themselves gay and protected those under them. One such household belonged to a minor aristocrat named Viscount Drumlanrig. Drumlanrig himself was discreet about his private life, but it was an open secret among the servant class that he preferred men. His household, as a result, became a kind of informal refuge. Gay servants sought positions there. They knew they would not be dismissed on suspicion alone. They knew Drumlanrig understood the stakes. Drumlanrig's story ended tragically. In 1894, he died under mysterious circumstances, officially ruled a hunting accident, but widely believed to be suicide. The rumours said he was about to be exposed in a scandal involving a senior political figure. Rather than face arrest and trial, he chose to die. He was 28 years old. When you read about his death in the newspaper, you thought about the butler at Marlborough House. You thought about the anonymous letter. You thought about how the same structures that had destroyed your small, quiet love had also destroyed a viscount. Class could delay the consequences, but it could not prevent them. Thomas read the same story. He said, "We are the lucky ones." You said, "How?" He said, "We are alive. We are together. We are not in prison, and we are not dead. That makes us lucky." You realized he was right. In 1893, you and Thomas celebrated what you privately called your anniversary. 7 years since you had met in Marlborough House. You did not celebrate the day you met. You could not remember it exactly. Instead, you celebrated the day you had kissed for the first time in the linen room. January 14th. You could not afford much, but you bought a small cake from a bakery, a plain sponge cake, nothing fancy, and you carried it home carefully. That night, you and Thomas and Albert sat in Albert's room and shared the cake and a pot of tea. You did not say what you were celebrating. Albert did not ask, but he raised his cup in a toast and said, "To friendship, to survival, to the future, whatever it brings." You drank to that. Thomas reached under the table and took your hand, hidden from view, and squeezed it once. You squeezed back. Later, alone in your room, Thomas gave you a gift. He had saved for weeks to buy it, a small pocket watch, second-hand but in good condition. He said he wanted you to have something that would last, something you could keep. You held the watch in your palm. It was cool and heavy. You opened it. Inside the cover, he had scratched 2 initials with a pin, T and your first initial, overlapping. You said, "You could be arrested for this. If someone sees it." He said, "Then do not let anyone see it." You kissed him. You wound the watch and put it in your pocket. You carried it every day for the rest of your life. By 1894, you and Thomas had been living together for 3 years. You were both 31 years old. You had survived longer than you had any right to expect. But survival is not the same as security. The boarding house where you lived was sold to a new owner in the spring of 1894. The new landlord was younger, more ambitious, and less tolerant. He raised the rent immediately. He started enforcing rules the previous landlady had ignored. No visitors after 10 at night, no cooking in the rooms, no noise. He walked through the building at odd hours, checking on tenants, making his presence known. Albert told you quietly that he was planning to leave. He said the new landlord made him nervous. He said it was only a matter of time before someone was accused of something, and he did not want to be there when it happened. Albert left in June. He gave you his new address, a boarding house in Islington, and made you promise to visit. You promised, though you both knew you probably would not. London was too big, and survival took too much energy to maintain friendships. The new landlord started asking questions about you and Thomas. Why were two grown men sharing a room? Why were you not married? Did you have family in London? You gave him the same story you had given the previous landlady. Cousins, temporary arrangement, looking for better work. He did not believe you. You could see it in his eyes. In August, he told you he was raising your rent again, double what you had been paying. He said it was because two people were occupying a single room. He said if you did not like it, you could leave. You could not afford double rent. You could barely afford what you had been paying. Thomas said, "We have to leave." You said, "And go where?" He said, "I do not know. But we cannot stay here." You started looking for a new place, but rooms were expensive and landlords asked questions. You visited a dozen boarding houses. Some said they had no space. Some said they did not take two men together. Some just looked at you and said no without explanation. You were running out of time. The new landlord had given you until the end of September to pay the increased rent or vacate. On a Sunday in mid-September, you and Thomas went for a walk to clear your heads. You ended up at St. Paul's Cathedral, the place you had chosen as your emergency meeting point. You sat on the steps and watched people pass. Families, couples, individuals, everyone moving through the city with purpose, with direction, with lives that made sense. Thomas said, "What if we left London entirely?" You said, "And went where?" He said, "I do not know. Somewhere smaller, somewhere cheaper." You said, "Somewhere we would be even more visible, somewhere we could not hide." He nodded. He knew. You sat in silence for a while. Then Thomas said, "Maybe we are not supposed to have this. Maybe the world just does not allow it." You looked at him. You said, "Do you believe that?" He said, "Some days." You said, "I do not. I think the world is cruel and unfair and stacked against us. But I do not think we are not supposed to have this. I think we are supposed to fight for it. And some days we lose, but we are still here. We are still fighting." Thomas leaned against you, just slightly, his shoulder touching yours. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it was enough. He said, "I am tired of fighting." You said, "I know. Me too." But you both knew you would keep fighting anyway, because the alternative was giving up. And giving up meant losing each other, and that was not an option. You found a room eventually in late September, just days before the landlord's deadline. It was in Bermondsey, south of the river, in a neighbourhood that smelled like tanneries and vinegar factories. The room was smaller than your previous one, barely large enough for the bed and a single chair. The walls were thin enough that you could hear every conversation in the neighbouring rooms. The window overlooked a narrow courtyard filled with rubbish bins and stray cats. But the landlord was old and half-blind and asked no questions beyond whether you could pay the rent. You said yes. He handed you a key. That was the entire transaction. You and Thomas moved in on a rainy October afternoon. You carried everything you owned in 2 canvas bags and a wooden crate. Your clothes, your books, the small spirit stove, the pocket watch, the letter Thomas had written 8 years ago, now so worn the creases had nearly separated the paper into pieces. That first night in Bermondsey, you lay in bed listening to the rain hammer against the window and the sound of someone arguing in the room next door. The mattress was lumpy. The blanket was too thin. The room was cold. Thomas said, "This is worse than Marlborough House." You said, "At least we are together." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. He said, "Is that enough?" You did not answer immediately, because you did not know. You wanted to say yes. You wanted to believe that love was enough, that being together was worth the poverty and the fear and the constant vigilance. But you were 31 years old and exhausted. and living in a room that smelled like mildew, and some days you were not sure. Finally you said, "It has to be." Thomas turned toward you in the dark. He said, "I am sorry." You said, "For what?" He said, "For not being able to give you more, for not being able to give you a real life." You said, "This is a real life. It is just a hard one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you ever regret it, meeting me?" You said, "Never." He said, "Not even when we were dismissed? Not even when you were sleeping in a doss house and starving?" You said, "Not even then." You meant it. Even in the worst moments, the nights you went hungry, the days you could not find work, the constant fear of arrest, you had never regretted loving him. You had regretted the world that made loving him dangerous. But you had never regretted him. Thomas moved closer. He rested his head against your chest. You could feel his breath, warm against your skin. He said, "I do not deserve you." You said, "Yes, you do." You held him until he fell asleep. You stayed awake longer, listening to the rain and the argument next door and the distant sound of a train rattling past on the nearby viaduct. You thought about the life you had imagined when you were 23 and newly hired at Marlborough House. You had thought you would rise through the ranks, become a senior footman, perhaps even a butler one day. You had thought you would retire with a small pension and enough saved to live comfortably. Instead, you were here, in a room that cost 4 shillings a week, working in a warehouse for wages that barely covered food and rent, living a secret life with a man you could never acknowledge publicly. But you were here, and he was here, and that had to be enough. The neighbourhood in Bermondsey was rougher than Southwark had been. The streets were narrower, darker, filled with people who had even less than you did. Drunks slept in doorways. Children with hollow eyes begged for pennies. The police came through occasionally, not to help but to harass, moving people along, making arrests for vagrancy or public drunkenness. You learned quickly to keep your head down. You walked to and from work without making eye contact. You spoke to no one. You became invisible again. But this time, it was not the trained invisibility of service. It was the desperate invisibility of survival. Thomas found work at a printer's shop in Southwark, which meant he had to walk nearly an hour each way. He left before dawn and returned after dark. His hands were always stained with ink. His shoulders ached from standing at the compositor's bench. He was losing weight again. You both were. You tried to make the room feel like home. You pinned up the drawing of the Sussex countryside that Thomas had carried with him from his previous rooms. You arranged the books on a small shelf you built from scrap wood. You bought a second-hand lamp so you could have light in the evenings without relying on the single candle you could afford. But the room resisted homemaking. It remained stubbornly temporary, a place you were passing through rather than living in. The walls stayed bare. The floorboards stayed cold. The window rattled in its frame every time the wind blew. In November, Thomas got sick. It started as a cough, dry and persistent. Then came the fever. He insisted he was fine, that he could still work, but after 3 days, he could barely stand. You made him stay in bed. You went to work at the warehouse and spent the entire day terrified that you would come home to find him dead. You bought medicine from a chemist, a bottle of cough syrup that cost 1 shilling, more than you could afford. The chemist looked at you with thinly disguised contempt, as if he knew you were poor and resented having to serve you. You took the medicine and left without meeting his eyes. Thomas drank the syrup. It did not help. The cough got worse. He started coughing up blood. Not much, just flecks of red on the handkerchief he held to his mouth. You tried not to panic. You told yourself it was just a bad cold. People recovered from bad colds all the time. But you had seen consumption before. Everyone had. It was everywhere in the working-class neighbourhoods of London, killing slowly, turning people into ghosts before finally taking them. You had seen it in the doss houses, in the warehouses, in the streets. You knew what it looked like. You sat by the bed and held Thomas's hand and tried to will him better. You prayed, even though you had not prayed since you were a child, even though you were not sure you believed in a God who would listen to someone like you. You prayed anyway. You begged, you bargained. You promised anything if Thomas would just survive. After a week, the fever broke. The cough eased. Thomas sat up in bed, pale and weak but alive. He drank the broth you made from bones begged from the butcher. He smiled at you, a tired shadow of his usual smile, and said, "I am not dying yet." You said, "Good." But you had been terrified. You had seen how easily it could all end. One illness, one bad winter, 1 week without wages for medicine, and you would lose him. Thomas recovered slowly. It took 3 weeks before he was strong enough to return to work. By then, you had spent nearly all your savings on medicine and food and rent. You were back to surviving day by day, with nothing left over. Let us talk about the other servants who had been at Marlborough House when you were there, because their stories intersect with yours in ways you would not know until much later. There had been a housemaid named Mary, young and sharp-tongued, who had been kind to you when you first arrived. She had shown you which rooms to clean in which order, had warned you about the housekeeper's temper, had smuggled you extra food from the kitchen when you were new and always hungry. You had liked her. She had never asked intrusive questions. She had never looked at you with suspicion. Years later you would learn that Mary had known. She had seen you and Thomas together, had understood what you were to each other, and had kept your secret. She had been dismissed herself a year after you left for stealing, though she had insisted she was innocent. No one had believed her. She had ended up working in a factory, and then she had disappeared from the records entirely. You would never know what happened to her, but you would always be grateful that she had not been the one who wrote the letter. There had been a groom named William who worked in the stables at Marlborough House. William had been friendly with Thomas, and you had been jealous, briefly, before you realized that William was not a rival but a kindred spirit. William had his own secrets. He had been in love with another groom, a man named Charles, and they had been careful the same way you and Thomas were careful. They had survived longer. William and Charles had worked together at Marlborough House for 5 years without being caught. But in 1890, Charles had been killed in an accident when a horse kicked him in the head. William had been there when it happened. He had held Charles as he died, and he had not been able to grieve publicly, because no one knew what Charles had been to him. William had left service after that. You saw him once, years later, in a pub in Whitechapel. He was drunk and alone, and he did not recognize you. You did not approach him. You just watched him for a moment and thought, "There, but for the grace of God." There had been a footman named George, the same George who had reported your nighttime absences to the butler. You hated George for years. You imagined elaborate revenges. You wished terrible things on him. But later, much later, you would wonder if George had been afraid, if he had seen something in you and Thomas that reminded him of something in himself, something he could not afford to acknowledge, if he had reported you not out of malice but out of self-preservation, trying to prove to himself and to the world that he was not like you. You would never know, but you would learn, eventually, to stop hating him. Hate took energy you did not have to spare. And there had been Frederick, the page who had served Queen Victoria for decades. You had never met Frederick, but you had heard about him from other servants. The man who survived by being indispensable. The man who knew everyone's secrets and kept them all. Frederick died in 1896, still in the Queen's service, at the age of 63. The Queen herself attended his funeral, a rare honour for a servant. The newspapers wrote brief obituaries noting his decades of loyal service. No one mentioned that he had never married. No one mentioned the quiet network of protection he had built for others like him. But the servants knew, and they remembered. In the spring of 1895, Oscar Wilde was arrested. You read about it in the newspapers. Everyone did. It was impossible to avoid. The Marquis of Queensberry had left a card at Wilde's club, accusing him of being a sodomite. Wilde had sued for libel. The trial had become a spectacle. Wilde's wit, his arrogance, his refusal to pretend, It was all laid out for public consumption. And then the libel trial had collapsed, and Wilde was arrested and charged under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, the same law that had hung over your head for nearly a decade. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. They printed every detail, the testimony of the young men Wilde had been with, the letters he had written, the hotel rooms, the gifts. Everything that had been private was now public. You read the coverage with a sick feeling in your stomach. Thomas read it too. You did not talk about it much. What was there to say? Wilde was convicted in May. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. The judge called it the worst case he had ever tried. The newspapers celebrated. The public cheered. A famous man had been brought low, and there was satisfaction in that. You thought about the difference between you and Wilde. He had been rich. He had been celebrated. He had been protected by fame and wealth and connections. And still, the law had destroyed him. What chance did you have? Thomas said, we have to be more careful. You said, we are already as careful as we can be. He said, not careful enough. After this, they are going to be watching everyone. They are going to be looking for more men to arrest. We cannot take any risks. You stopped going to the 100 Guineas. You stopped any public displays, even the smallest ones. You became strangers in public, 2 men who happened to live in the same room. Nothing more. At night, behind a locked door, you held each other and tried not to think about prison. The Wilde trial changed something in London. There was a crackdown. Police raided more pubs, more parks, more private homes. Men were arrested on the flimsiest evidence, an overheard conversation, a suspicious living arrangement, an anonymous accusation. The prisons filled with men whose only crime was loving other men. You knew 3 men who were arrested in the 6 months after Wilde's conviction. None of them were close friends, but you knew them from the network, from the pubs, from the whispered conversations in back rooms. One was sentenced to 6 months, one to a year. One killed himself before the trial. You and Thomas talked about leaving London. Not seriously, you had no money, no prospects elsewhere, but you talked about it the way people talk about fantasies. What if you went to the countryside? What if you found a small village where no one knew you? What if you pretended to be brothers? But you both knew it would not work. The countryside was not safer. It was less anonymous. Everyone knew everyone. Strangers were watched more closely. Secrets were harder to keep. So you stayed in Bermondsey, in your small room that smelled like mildew, and you survived. In 1896, you turned 33. Thomas turned 33. You had been together, on and off, for 10 years. You had been living together for 5. You did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. But you marked the occasion in your own way. You went to a chop house and bought 2 meat pies and 2 pints of beer. You brought them back to your room and ate them sitting on the bed. And for an hour, you pretended you were ordinary people having an ordinary evening. Thomas said, "Do you remember the linen room?" You said, "Every detail." He said, "I was so scared. I thought you would push me away. I thought you would report me." You said, "I thought the same thing about you." He laughed. He said, "We were idiots." You said, "We were young." He said, "We are not that much older now." You said, "We are lifetimes older." He nodded. He understood what you meant. The years had not been kind. You both looked older than 33. You both moved like men who had worked too hard for too long. You both had the wariness of people who had survived things that should have killed them. Thomas said, "If you could go back, knowing everything that would happen, would you still kiss me that night in the linen room?" You did not hesitate. You said, "Yes," he said. "Even knowing we would be dismissed? Even knowing we would end up here?" You said, "Even knowing all of it?" He smiled. He leaned over and kissed you, tasting like meat pie and beer, and the life you had built together out of nothing. He said, "Good, because I would too." Let us talk about the servant hierarchy at Marlborough House. Because understanding it helps you understand why your dismissal was so devastating. At the top was the butler. The butler ran the household. He managed the male servants, oversaw the wine cellar, coordinated with the housekeeper, and answered directly to the Prince of Wales's private secretary. The butler at Marlborough House when you worked there was a man named Mr. Pritchard, who had been in service for 30 years and who ran the household with military precision. He was the one who had interrogated you. He was the one who had dismissed you. Below the butler were the footmen, ranked by seniority. The first footman was the most senior. He trained the younger footmen, oversaw their work, and stepped in when the butler was unavailable. You had been a second footman, which meant you were still relatively junior. Thomas had been a third footman, which was even lower. Below the footmen were the hall boys, who did the dirtiest work, cleaning boots, carrying coal, scrubbing floors. Below them were the outdoor staff, the grooms, the coachmen, the gardeners. The hierarchy was strict. You did not speak to someone above your rank unless spoken to first. You did not sit at meals until those senior to you were seated. You did not question orders. This hierarchy extended beyond the household. In the servant world of Victorian London, your position determined your status. A butler or housekeeper in a royal household was aristocracy among servants. A footman in a royal household was respectable. A hall boy in a royal household was still enviable. When you were dismissed, you lost all of that. You went from being a respectable footman in a royal household to being unemployed with no reference. In the servant world, that was a fall from grace steeper than any physical fall. You were untouchable. No respectable household would hire you. Your career was over before it had really begun. This is why so many dismissed servants ended up in poverty. It was not just that they lost their job. They lost their entire social position. They lost their future. Thomas had understood this immediately. You had taken longer to fully grasp it, but by the time you were living in Bermondsey, working in a warehouse for a fraction of what you would have earned as a butler, you understood perfectly. You had lost more than a job. You had lost a world. In early 1897, you were walking home from work when you saw a man you recognized. He was standing on a street corner in Southwark, well-dressed, too well-dressed for the neighbourhood. He was watching the workers stream out of the factories and warehouses, his eyes moving from face to face. You recognized him immediately. He was the man Peter had warned you about years ago, at the 100 Guineas, the informer, the man who made money by identifying gay men to the police. Your heart started pounding. You kept walking, trying to look casual, trying not to draw attention. But the man's eyes landed on you. He watched you. You saw recognition in his face. Not specific recognition, but the recognition of type. He saw something in you that marked you. You turned down a side street, walking faster. You did not look back. When you finally reached your boarding house, you took the stairs 2 at a time and locked the door behind you. Thomas was home already. He looked up from the book he was reading and saw your face. He said, "What happened?" You told him. You described the man, the way he had looked at you, the sick feeling of being seen. Thomas went pale. He said, "Did he follow you?" You said, "I do not think so." He said, "Are you sure?" You said, "No." You both sat in silence for a moment. Then Thomas stood up and checked the door to make sure it was locked. He moved the chair in front of it, a makeshift barricade. He pulled the curtain closed over the window. He said, "We need to be ready. If the police come, we say we are cousins. We stick to the story. We do not admit anything." You said, "They will search the room. They will find—" Thomas cut you off. He said, "We have nothing incriminating. No letters, no photographs, nothing they can use." You thought about the pocket watch he had given you with your initials scratched inside. You did not mention it. You just nodded. That night, neither of you slept. You lay in bed, fully clothed, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Listening for a knock that would mean police. Listening for the end. The knock never came. But the fear stayed. You started varying your route home from work. You left at different times when you could. You avoided busy streets where you might be noticed. You stopped making eye contact with anyone. Thomas did the same. He took a longer route to the print shop, even though it added 20 minutes to his walk. He stayed late at work some nights, leaving after dark when he was less visible. You were living in constant fear again. It was exhausting. More exhausting than the physical labor, more exhausting than the hunger, more exhausting than the poverty. The fear was a weight that never lifted. In March, Thomas said, "I cannot do this anymore." You looked at him. You said, "Cannot do what?" He said, "This. Living like this. Always afraid, always hiding. I am 34 years old, and I feel like I am 80. You said, "What are you saying?" He said, "I do not know. I am just tired." You were tired too. So tired, you could barely remember what it felt like not to be tired. You said, "Do you want to leave?" Leave me? Thomas looked at you like you had struck him. He said, "No. God, no. I want a different life. I want to wake up without being afraid. I want to walk down a street without looking over my shoulder. I want to hold your hand in public. I want—" He stopped. His voice had broken. You pulled him close. You held him while he cried. You did not cry. You had learned years ago that crying did not help. But you held him and let him cry and thought, there is no different life. This is the only life we get. But you did not say that. You just held him until he stopped crying. And then you made tea, and you sat together in silence, and you survived another day. In the summer of 1897, Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. 60 years on the throne. The whole city erupted in celebration. Parades, parties, fireworks. The royal family appeared on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, and thousands of people cheered. You and Thomas watched from a distance. You stood in a crowd in Suffolk, too far away to see anything clearly, just watching the fireworks light up the sky over the Thames. Someone in the crowd was singing, "God Save the Queen." Others joined in. You mouthed the words but did not sing. You thought about Marlborough House. You thought about the linen room. You thought about the life you had been dismissed from. Thomas said, "Do you miss it?" You knew what he meant. He meant service. He meant the structure, the hierarchy, the sense of purpose, the clean uniforms and the full meals, and the certainty of knowing where you belonged. You said, "Sometimes." He said, "Me too." You stood there in the crowd, surrounded by people celebrating the Queen, and you felt utterly separate from them. They were celebrating empire and glory and 60 years of reign. You were mourning a life you had lost because you loved the wrong person. Thomas reached out and squeezed your hand once, briefly, hidden in the crowd. Then he let go. You watched the fireworks until they ended. Then you walked home in silence. In 1898, the warehouse where you worked closed without warning. The owner had gone bankrupt. You arrived one Monday morning to find the doors chained and a notice posted stating that all operations had ceased. No final wages were paid. No explanation was given beyond the legal notice. You stood on the street with 24 other workers, all of you staring at the locked doors, all of you realizing simultaneously that you had just lost everything. You were 35 years old and unemployed again. The pattern was familiar by now. You spent the next morning at the docks, standing in the crowd of men hoping to be picked for day labor. You were not picked. You tried again, the next day, and the next. On the fourth day, a foreman pointed at you and 15 others. You spent 12 hours unloading timber from a ship. The splinters worked their way under your skin. Your shoulders screamed. At the end of the day, you were paid 9p. 9p for 12 hours. You went home to Thomas and put the coins on the table. He looked at them. He looked at you. Neither of you said anything. There was nothing to say. Thomas's wages from the print shop were barely enough to cover rent. Your 9p would buy bread for 3 days if you were careful. After that, you did not know. You tried to find steady work. You tried factories, warehouses, shops. You were too old for some positions. They wanted younger men who could work harder for less. You were too unskilled for others. They wanted men with specific training you did not have. And always, they asked for references from previous employers. You had none. Or rather, you had one, but you could never use it. Marlborough House might as well have been a dream you once had. By June, you were 3 weeks behind on rent. The landlord knocked on your door. He was not unkind, but he was firm. He said if you did not pay by the end of the week, you would have to leave. He had other tenants waiting. He could not afford to keep a room occupied by people who could not pay. You promised him you would pay. You had no idea how. That night, Thomas said, "We could try the workhouse." You looked at him. The workhouse was where you went when you had exhausted every other option. It was shelter and food, but it came at a cost. You would be separated. Men and women were housed separately, and 2 unrelated men would be questioned extensively about why they needed to enter together. You would be put to work at hard labour. You would lose what little autonomy you still had, and if anyone discovered what you were to each other, you would be thrown out, or worse. You said, "Not yet." Thomas said, "Then what?" You said, "I will find something. I will." You did not find something. At the end of June, you and Thomas packed your few belongings and left the boarding house in Bermondsey. You had nowhere to go. You spent that night sleeping rough, under a railway arch near London Bridge. The ground was hard and cold. The arch smelled like urine and coal smoke. Other men were sleeping there too, shapes huddled against the brick walls, invisible in the darkness. Thomas lay next to you, his back pressed against yours for warmth. He said, "I am sorry." You said, "For what?" He said, "For this, for all of it." You said, "This is not your fault." He said, "It feels like it is." You did not know what to say to that, so you said nothing. You just pressed back against him, sharing what little warmth you had, and listened to the trains rattle overhead and tried not to think about what came next. You lived on the streets for 6 weeks. It is a period of your life you would later try not to remember, though you never fully succeeded in forgetting. You and Thomas stayed together. That was the most important thing. Some of the men living rough were alone, and they did not last long. But you had each other. You watched each other's backs. You shared what little food you could get. You took turns sleeping so one of you was always awake to guard against theft or worse. You learned the geography of homelessness, which railway arches were safest, which alleyways had the fewest rats, which parks allowed you to sleep until dawn before the police moved you along, which church steps were sheltered from the rain. You learned which charities gave out soup and when. You learned which public fountains had drinkable water. You learned how to make a penny stretch across 2 days. Thomas got a few days of work here and there, carrying advertising boards through the streets for $1 a day. You got occasional work at the docks when the foreman was desperate. But most days there was no work. Most days you just tried to survive. You were hungry all the time, not the temporary hunger of missing a meal, but the deep, gnawing hunger that never stopped. Your body started to consume itself. Your ribs became visible. Your cheeks hollowed. Your clothes hung loose on a frame that was disappearing. Thomas fared worse. He had always been thinner than you, and he had never fully recovered from the illness the previous winter. He developed a cough again. Not as bad as before, but persistent. You tried to get him to rest, but there was nowhere to rest. You tried to get him to eat, but there was barely enough food for one, let alone 2. One night in late July, you woke to find Thomas burning with fever. You were under a railway arch in Southwark, surrounded by a dozen other rough sleepers. Thomas was shaking. His skin was hot to the touch. His eyes were unfocused. You did not know what to do. You had no money for a doctor. You had no money for medicine. You had nothing. One of the other men sleeping nearby, an older man with a long grey beard, crawled over. He looked at Thomas. He said, "Hospital. You need to get him to a hospital." You said, "They will not take him. Not without money." The old man said, "Guy's Hospital takes charity cases. It is not far. You can carry him if you have to." You looked at Thomas, who was barely conscious, and you thought, "I am going to lose him. After everything, this is how I lose him." But you could not lose him without trying. You pulled Thomas to his feet. You half carried, half dragged him through the pre-dawn streets to Guy's Hospital on the South Bank. It took you an hour. By the time you arrived, your arms were shaking with exhaustion and Thomas was unconscious. The hospital was a large stone building, imposing and cold. You carried Thomas to the door marked Casualties and pushed it open. Inside was a long hallway with benches along the walls. A dozen people were waiting, some bleeding, some coughing, some just sitting with the glazed expression of those who had given up. A nurse appeared. She was middle-aged, stern-looking, with a white apron and a no-nonsense manner. She looked at you and Thomas and said, "What is the nature of the emergency?" You said, "Fever." Cough. He cannot breathe properly. She felt Thomas's forehead. She looked at his eyes. She said, "When did this start?" You said, "Tonight." "But he's been sick on and off for months." She said, "Name?" You said, "Thomas. Thomas Barrett." She wrote it down. She said, "And you are?" You hesitated. You said, "His cousin." She looked at you with an expression that suggested she did not believe you, but also did not care. She said, "Wait here." 2 orderlies came and took Thomas away on a stretcher. You tried to follow, but the nurse stopped you. She said, "Family only, and only during visiting hours. Come back tomorrow at 2. You said, "I need to stay with him." She said, "Those are the rules." You wanted to argue. You wanted to push past her and follow Thomas wherever they were taking him. But you were exhausted and filthy and you knew you had no power here. So you nodded. You said, "Tomorrow at 2. She said, "If he is admitted, he will be in the men's ward. Ask at the front desk." You left the hospital and stood on the street as the sun came up. You had not slept. You had not eaten. You did not know if Thomas would survive. But he was in a hospital being cared for, and that was more than you could have given him. You walked back to the railway arch. The old man with the grey beard was still there. He asked if your friend was all right. You said you did not know. He nodded. He said, "The waiting is the worst part." You sat down and waited for tomorrow. You went back to Guy's Hospital the next day at 2. You had spent the intervening hours trying to find work, trying to get money, trying to do anything useful. You had failed at all of it, but you had washed your face and hands in a public fountain and tried to make yourself presentable. The hospital had a front desk staffed by a woman in spectacles who looked like she had not smiled in years. You told her you were there to visit Thomas Barrett. She checked a ledger. She said, "Men's ward, 3rd floor. Visiting hours until 4. You climbed the stairs. Your legs were weak from hunger and exhaustion, but you climbed. The men's ward was a long room with 30 beds arranged in 2 rows. The smell hit you first. Carbolic soap, illness, unwashed bodies, something medicinal you could not identify. The windows were open, but it did not help. You found Thomas in a bed near the far end. He was awake. He looked pale and exhausted, but alive. When he saw you, he smiled weakly. You sat in the chair next to his bed. You said, "How are you?" He said, "I have been better." His voice was hoarse. The cough was still there, but the fever had broken. They had given him fluids, rest, some kind of tonic. He was being cared for. He said, "They asked a lot of questions. About me. About you. I told them we were cousins." You said, "Good." He said, "I do not think they believed me." But they did not push. You sat with him for 2 hours. You did not talk much. There was not much to say, but you held his hand when no one was looking, and that was enough. At 4, a nurse came through and announced that visiting hours were over. You stood to leave. Thomas caught your hand. He said, "Where will you sleep tonight?" You said, "The same place. Under the arch. I will be fine." He said, "Be careful." You said, "I will." You kissed his forehead quickly, a gesture that could have been brotherly and left before anyone noticed. Thomas was in Guy's Hospital for 3 weeks. You visited every day during visiting hours. You spent the rest of your time trying to survive, trying to find work, trying to hold on until he was released. On your 5th visit, one of the doctors stopped you in the hallway. He was a young man, not much older than you, with tired eyes and ink stains on his fingers. He said, "Are you the cousin?" You said, "Yes." He looked at you for a long moment. Then he said, "He is malnourished. Severely. The fever was just a symptom. His body is failing because he is not getting enough food. If he goes back to the conditions he came from, he will be back here within a month, or he will die on the street." You said, "I know." The doctor said, "Can you not find somewhere for him to stay? Family, friends?" You said, "We have no one." The doctor looked frustrated. He said, "There are charities, organizations that help. Have you tried them?" You had tried. Most charities required proof of good character, references, evidence that you were deserving poor rather than undeserving poor. You had none of those things. You said, "We have tried." The doctor sighed. He said, "He can stay here another week. After that, we need the bed. I'm sorry." You nodded. You said, "Thank you for helping him." The doctor looked at you. He said, "You are not really cousins, are you?" Your heart stopped. You said nothing. The doctor said, "It is all right. I do not care. I am just saying, whatever you are to each other, he needs you to figure something out. He will not survive without help." He walked away before you could respond. Let us talk about medical care for the poor in Victorian London, because it is important to understand what Thomas was experiencing. Guy's Hospital was one of several teaching hospitals in London that accepted charity patients. These patients, people who could not afford private doctors, were treated for free in exchange for allowing medical students to observe and learn from their cases. It was not altruism, it was a transaction. You got medical care. The hospital got teaching material. The care was basic but often effective. Clean beds, regular meals, medicine when available. For someone like Thomas, who had been starving and sick on the street, it was life-saving. But the hospitals were always overcrowded. Beds were limited. Priority was given to acute cases, people who would die without immediate intervention. Chronic conditions like malnutrition or consumption were lower priority. You were treated, stabilized, and discharged as quickly as possible to make room for the next patient. The other option for the desperately poor was the workhouse infirmary. These were even more basic than the hospitals. The care was minimal. The conditions were grim, but it was shelter and food, which was more than the streets offered. The historian Michael Warboys, in his research on urban poverty and health in Victorian Britain, documented mortality rates among the homeless. In the 1890s, the average life expectancy for someone sleeping rough in London was less than 5 years after they became homeless. Most died of illness, exposure, malnutrition, or violence. The streets were a death sentence in slow motion. You knew all this. You had seen it. You had watched men disappear, here 1 week, gone the next, no one knowing if they had moved on or died in an alley somewhere. You were determined that would not be Thomas. On Thomas's last day in the hospital, you arrived during visiting hours with a plan. It was not a good plan, but it was the only one you had. You said, "When you are discharged, we are going to the Salvation Army shelter." Thomas looked at you. The Salvation Army had opened several shelters for the homeless in the 1890s, offering beds and meals in exchange for attending religious services and submitting to their rules. The shelters were clean, safe, and free. They were also intensely Christian, with a focus on moral reform. Many of the men who stayed there were pressured to renounce their sins, to reform their ways, to be saved. For 2 gay men, this was dangerous territory. Thomas said, "They will ask questions." You said, "We will say we are cousins. We will keep our heads down. We will survive long enough to get back on our feet." Thomas said, "And if they figure it out?" You said, "Then we leave. But we have to try. You cannot go back to the streets." The doctor said, "You will die." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, we try." The Salvation Army shelter was in Whitechapel, a neighborhood you knew well from your early days on the streets. The building was plain but clean, a converted warehouse with rows of narrow beds on the upper floor and a dining hall on the ground floor. You and Thomas arrived in the early evening. A woman at the entrance took your names and asked a few questions. Where were you from? How long had you been homeless? Did you have family? Were you willing to attend services? You answered carefully. You were cousins. You had been out of work for several months. You had no family in London. You were willing to do whatever was required. The woman nodded. She said, "Men's dormitory is upstairs. Dinner is at 6. Morning service is at 7. If you miss service, you lose your bed. Understood?" You said, "Understood." She handed you each a ticket with a number. She said, "Present this at meals. No drinking, no fighting, no swearing, no immoral behavior of any kind. If you break the rules, you will be asked to leave." That last line hung in the air. No immoral behavior of any kind. You took the tickets. You said, "Thank you." The dormitory was a long room with 50 beds, all identical. Iron frames with thin mattresses and wool blankets. The beds were close together, no more than 2 feet between them. There was no privacy, no curtains, no partitions, just 50 men in one room. You and Thomas were assigned beds at opposite ends of the room. Deliberately, you suspected. The Salvation Army was not naive. They knew that men sometimes formed inappropriate attachments. They managed this by separation. That first night, you lay in your narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about Thomas at the other end of the room. You could not see him. You could not speak to him. You could only hope he was safe, that he was warm, that he was eating, that he was surviving. You told yourself this was temporary. You would stay long enough to get back on your feet. You would find work. You would save money. You would get a room again. And then you and Thomas would leave and rebuild. You told yourself this. You tried to believe it. The routine at the Salvation Army shelter was strict. You woke at 6 to the sound of a bell. You washed at communal sinks with cold water. You attended morning service at 7, which consisted of hymns and a sermon about sin and redemption. Then you were free to leave for the day to look for work. You had to be back by 8 in the evening for dinner, another service at 9, lights out at 10. If you missed any part of this routine without a good excuse, you lost your bed for the night. Thomas was still weak from his illness. He could not work yet. He spent his days at the shelter, helping in the kitchen, doing small tasks, slowly rebuilding his strength. You went out every day looking for work. Some days you found a few hours of labor. Some days you found nothing. After 2 weeks, you found steady work. A factory in Bethnal Green needed someone to manage their inventory. The pay was low, but regular. 10 shillings a week. It was enough to start saving. You told Thomas. He smiled, and it was the first real smile you had seen from him in months. He said, "How long until we can leave here?" You did your calculations. Rent for a room would be 4 shillings a week. Food for 2 would be another 3 or 4 shillings. You needed enough saved for first and last month's rent, plus a cushion in case something went wrong. At least 10 weeks. You said, 3 months, maybe less. Thomas nodded. He said, "I can wait 3 months." You lasted 6 weeks at the Salvation Army shelter before everything fell apart. It started with a man named Robert. Robert was another resident of the shelter, a man in his late 20s who had been there for several months. He was loud, aggressive, and deeply committed to the Salvation Army's mission of moral reform. He spent his evenings preaching to the other men about sin and salvation, and he seemed to take a particular interest in identifying sinners. Robert noticed you and Thomas. He saw that you arrived together. He saw that you sometimes spoke quietly in corners when you thought no one was watching. He saw Thomas's lingering glances when you returned from work each evening. One night after service, Robert approached you in the dormitory. He said, "You and that man, Thomas, you are too close." You said, "He is my cousin." Robert said, "You are lying. I can see it." "You think I am blind?" You said, "I do not know what you are talking about." Robert stepped closer. He said, "I am going to tell them. I am going to tell the staff what you are. They will throw you both out, and then you will get what you deserve." You felt your hands clench into fists. You forced yourself to stay calm. You said, "You are mistaken." Robert smiled, a mean smile. He said, "We will see." You found Thomas immediately and told him what had happened. Thomas went pale. He said, "We need to leave. Tonight." You said, "And go where? We are not ready. We do not have enough saved." Thomas said, "I do not care. If we stay, he will destroy us." You knew he was right. You went back to your bed and gathered your few belongings. Thomas did the same. You slipped out of the shelter before evening service, before anyone could stop you, before Robert could make good on his threat. You were back on the streets. The second time on the streets was harder than the first. It was autumn now, and the nights were getting cold. Thomas was still not fully recovered, and the brief period of regular meals and warmth had made him even more vulnerable to the elements. You were exhausted. You had been so close to stability, and now it was gone. You spent the first night under the same railway arch where you had slept months before. The old man with the grey beard was gone. You did not know if he had moved on or died. There were different faces now, but the same desperation. Thomas's cough came back within 3 days. You tried everything you could think of. You begged for money. You stole food when you could. You found sheltered places to sleep. But none of it was enough. 1 week after leaving the Salvation Army shelter, Thomas collapsed on the street. You were walking together near the docks, and he just fell. One moment he was walking beside you. The next he was on the ground, unconscious. People walked past. No one stopped. No one helped. In Victorian London, seeing a man collapse on the street was so common it barely registered. You dropped to your knees beside him. You shook him. You said his name. He did not respond. You picked him up. He weighed almost nothing, and you carried him. You did not know where you were going. You just walked. You walked until you found a constable standing on a corner, and you begged him for help. The constable looked at you both with disgust. He said, "Take him to the workhouse. That is what it is for." You said, "Please. He needs a hospital. He is dying." The constable said, "Then take him to the workhouse infirmary." "I cannot help you." He walked away. You stood there on the street, holding Thomas, and you realized you were out of options. You had fought for 12 years to avoid the workhouse, but there was nowhere else left. You carried Thomas to the Whitechapel workhouse. You walked through the gates. You told the intake officer that you needed help, that your cousin was dying. The officer barely looked at you. He said, "Men's ward is through there. Someone will examine him." They took Thomas from you. They took him through a door, and it closed behind him, and you were alone in a cold hallway. A different officer appeared. He said, "Name?" You told him. He said, "Relationship to the patient." You said, "Cousin." He wrote it down. He said, "You can visit during designated hours, Sundays at 2. You said, "When will I know if he is all right?" The officer said, "Someone will inform you if there is a change in his condition." You said, "Can I see him? Just for a moment." The officer said, "No. Come back Sunday." You left the workhouse and stood outside the gates and tried not to scream. You had just handed Thomas over to the one place you had both spent years trying to avoid. The place where men went to die. The place where dignity and hope went to die. But it was the only option left. You walked away. You had nowhere to go and no way to help him, so you just walked.